Hi guys, I wanted to start reading a chapter book. It's a children's literature chapter book, but I thought it would be fun um, for my older kids, but it still is a really cool one for the little ones to listen to as well. It has some really awesome illustrations. It's actually by the famous author Neil Gaiman. He is the same guy who wrote Coraline. A lot of you guys might have seen the movie Coraline, but like all great movies, it was a book first. So this one tonight is a spin on Nordic mythology. So a little bit of history lesson there for you as well. This, for those of you who don't know what Nordic mythology is, and you love Avengers, so it's like Thor, where the Thor comes from in history and mythology. This is about the frost giants and all that kind of mythological history. Really, really cool, awesome illustrations by Chris Riddle. He's the illustrator, and Neil Gaiman is the author. And tonight's story is Odd and the Frost Giants. So you can even see on the cover, this is Odd. This is one of the frost giants, and it's really cool. This is the goddess Freya. And then a frost giant carved in wood, what they thought that they looked like carved. And then this is the illustrator's depiction. So I think this is going to be a really cool book for you guys to look at. Here's another awesome illustration of the frost giant. It's all like this. It's all black and white, like graphic novel type illustrations. So they have to put a lot of detail in the eyes and every little crack and crevice because there's no color to catch your eye. It's all black and white. Odd is the name of the boy in the story. So Odd and the Frost Giants. It's another illustration. And then this is the really cool, you find it in historical pieces for the Scandinavian and Nordic people. This is what a lot of their carvings, this would have been carved in wood. And the illustrator did like a metallic effect on the paper, so that's really cool. So my videographer, my husband, is going to keep the camera on the pictures for you guys because there's so many little details that you can be looking at the details while I read the scripted part. Chapter 1, Odd. There was a boy called Odd, and there was nothing strange or unusual about that. Not in that time or place. Odd meant the tip of a blade, and it was a lucky name. He was odd, though. At least the other villagers thought so. But if there was one thing he wasn't, it was lucky. His father had been killed during a sea raid 2 years before, when Odd was 10. It was not unknown for people to get killed in the sea raids, but his father wasn't killed by a Scotsman, dying in glory in the heat of battle as a Viking should. He had jumped overboard to rescue one of the stocky little ponies that they had took with them on their raids as pack animals. They would load the ponies up with all the gold and valuables and food and weapons that they could find, and the ponies would trudge back to the longships. The ponies were the most valuable and hardworking thing on the ship. After Olaf the Tall was killed by a Scotsman, Odd's father had to look after the ponies. Odd's father wasn't very experienced with the ponies, being a woodcutter and a woodcarver by trade, but he did his best. On the return journey, one of the ponies got loose during a squall off the Orkney and fell overboard. Odd's father jumped into the gray sea with a rope, pulled the pony back to the ship, and with the other Vikings hauled it back on deck. So there's one of the Viking longships that they're talking about in the story. He died before the next morning of the cold and the wet and the water in his lungs. When they returned to Norway, they told Odd's mother, and Odd's mother told Odd. Odd just shrugged. He didn't cry. He didn't say anything. Nobody knew what Odd was feeling on the inside. Nobody knew what he thought. And in a village on the banks of Fjord, where everybody knew everybody's business, this was infuriating. There were no full-time Vikings back then, Everybody had another job. Seed raiding was just something the men did for fun or to get things they couldn't find in their village. They even got their wives that way. Odd's mother, who was as dark as Odd's father had been fair, had been brought to Yord on a longship from Scotland. She would sing Odd the ballads that she had learned as a girl, back before Odd's father had taken her knife away and thrown her over his shoulder and carried her back to the longship. Odd wondered if she missed Scotland, but when he asked her, she said no, not really. She just missed people who spoke her language. She could speak the language of the Norse now, but with an accent. Odd's father had been the master of the axe. He had a one-room cabin that he had built from logs deep in the little forest behind Yord. He would go out to the woods and return a week or so later with his handcart piled high with logs, all ready to weather and to split, for they made everything they could out of wood in those parts. Wooden nails joined the wooden boards to build wooden dwellings or wooden boats. In the winter, when the snows were too deep for travel, Odd's father would sit by the fire and carve, making wood into faces and toys and drinking cups and bowls, while Odd's mother sewed and cooked and always sang. She had a beautiful voice. So here's his mom. Here's him remembering his mom when he was little and his dad, and look at all that carving in the wood. Odd didn't understand the words of the song she sang, but she would translate them after she had sung them, and his head would roll with the fine lords riding out on their great horses, their noble falcons on their wrists, brave hounds always patting their sides, off to get into all manner of trouble, fighting giants, rescuing maidens, and freeing the oppressed from tyranny. After Odd's father died, his mother sang less and less. Odd kept smiling, though. It drove the villagers mad. He even smiled after the accident that crippled his left leg. It was 3 weeks after the longship had come back without his father's body. Odd had taken his father's tree-cutting axe, so huge he could barely lift it, and had hauled it out to the woods, certain that he knew all there was to know about cutting trees, and determined to put this knowledge into practice. He should possibly be admitted to his mother later, having used the smaller axe and a smaller tree to practice on. Still, what he did was remarkable. After the tree had fallen on his foot, he had used the axe to dig away the earth beneath his leg and had pulled it out. He had cut a branch to make himself a crutch to lean on, for the bones in his leg were shattered, and somehow he had got himself home, hauling his father's heavy axe with him, for metal was rare in those hills, and axes needed to be bartered or stolen, and he could not have left it to rust. So this is the scene that the illustrator Chris Riddle came up with after Neil Gaiman, the author, wrote that whole passage that I just read to you. There's Odd limping home with a giant axe behind him. Two years passed. So this picture here, he's not a little boy anymore, right? He's 2 years older. 2 years passed, and Odd's mother married Fat Alfred. He was ample enough when he had not been drinking, but he already had 4 sons and 3 daughters from a previous marriage. His wife had been struck by lightning. What a way to go. And he had no time for a crippled stepson, so Odd spent more and more time out in the great woods. Odd loved the spring when the waterfalls began to course down the valleys and the woodland was covered with flowers. He liked the summer when the fresh berries began to ripen, and the autumn when there was nuts and small apples. Odd did not care for winter, when the villagers spent as much time as they could in the village's great hall, eating and drinking salted meat and rooted vegetables. In the winter, the men would fight and fart and sing and sleep and wake and fight again. And the women would shake their heads and sew and knit and mend. So that's what this picture is showing you, what they're doing in the winter time. By March, the worst of the winter would be over. The snow would thaw, the rivers begin to run, the world would wake into itself again. Not that year. Winter hung in there like an invalid refusing to die. Day after gray day, the ice stayed hard. The world remained unfriendly and cold. In the village, people got on one another's nerves. They'd been staring at each other across the great hall for 4 months now. It was time for the men to make Longship seaworthy, time for the women to start clearing the ground for planting. The games became nasty. The jokes became mean, and fights were to hurt this time. This is why one morning at the end of March, some hours before the sun was up, when the frost was hard and the ground still like iron, while Fat Alfred and his children and Odd's mother were still asleep, Odd put on his thickest, warmest clothes, stole a side of smoke-blackened salmon from where it hung in the rafters at Fat Alfred's house, and a fire pot with a handful of glowing embers from the fire. He took his father's second-best axe, which he tied by leather thong to his belt, and limped out into the woods. The snow was deep and treacherous, with thick, shiny crust of ice. It would have been a hard walking for a man with 2 good legs, but for a boy with 1 good leg, 1 very bad leg, and a wooden crutch, every hill felt like a mountain. So there's Odd. Let's find out where he went into the woods. Odd crossed a frozen lake, which should have melted weeks before, and went deep into the woods. The days seemed almost as short as they had been in midwinter, and although it was only mid-afternoon, it was dark as night by the time he reached his father's old wood-cutting hut. The door was blocked by snow, and Odd had to take a wooden spade and dig it out before he could enter. He fed the fire pot with kindling and tended it until he felt safe, transferring the fire into the fireplace, where the old logs were dry. On the floor he found a lump of wood slightly bigger than his fist. He was going to throw it on the fire, but his fingers felt carving on the small wooden block, and so he put it to one side and to look at it when it was light. He gathered snow in a small pan and melted it over the fire, and he ate smoked fish and hot berry water. It was good. There were blankets in the corners still, and straw-stuffed mattresses, and he would imagine that the little room smelled of his father, and nothing hit him or called him cripple or an idiot. And so, after building the fire high enough that it would still be burning in the morning, he went to sleep quiet and happy. So this is our picture for chapter 2, to give you an idea. The title is The Fox, the Eagle, and the Bear. So think about that. And tomorrow night I will upload chapter 2 of Odd and the Frost Giants by Neil Gaiman. Bye, Eagles.